Welcome to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning talk show featuring guests sharing their stories and knowledge. We discuss the healing aspects of the arts, metaphysics, social justice, and adventure through all types of terrain. So join me, Pandora Peoples, here on WOMR 92.1 FM in Provincetown and WFMR 91.3 FM in Orleans. We're streaming worldwide at WOMR.org. Our theme music is provided by Mason. You can find her website at masonmusic.com. That's MAESYN. Hello, Cape Cod and beyond. I am here with my guest today, filmmaker Jon-Sesrie Goff, and he is the filmmaker of After Sherman. It shows tomorrow, Friday at 4:30 and Sunday at 11 a.m. at the Water's Edge Cinema. It's part of the Provicetown Intl Film Festival, and I am so happy that you are here with us today, John. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I really appreciate your film. In your film, After Sherman, we discover that under the orders of General William Sherman, the ancestral home of the Gullah people was originally deeded to freed slaves after the Civil War, but the real estate of the southern U.S. coast is eyed by wealthy, tax hikes and land auctions threaten the homes of the people who have been stewards of this region for generations. So how did you come to tell this story, and when did you discover your connection to the legacy, your forefather who founded many AME, African Methodist Episcopal churches at a time when there were laws against Black people congregating?
Always aware of this history. It's the community and space in which I grew up in, even when we lived in other parts of the country, be it New England, Hartford, Connecticut. It's actually where I was born, and or Rochester, New York, where my family also lived before returning to South Carolina. And it was always interesting because there was this tension between it being such a familial home space in this tourist destination. I think from Myrtle Beach to Charleston, it's such a clash of cultures and I exist somewhere between them. And so I was always curious about the history and the stories of people. And I was so fortunate that my grandmother and other elders in my family would just share these things freely with me. And so it was very much the fabric of sort of my life.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful to understand your legacy and your heritage growing up. You had mentioned in the film something about this Civil War reenactments happening with in your neighborhood. Can you just share a little bit? Because then I'm like,
it's much more innocent than it came across in the film. The power of the edit. What my friends, and we've talked about it since, and actually fairly recently while I was still working on the project, it's such a part of Americana that if you're not really consciously thinking about race, it's no different than children playing cowboys and Indians, or, you're reenacting historical moments. And my neighbors went through a phase of really being obsessed with the Civil War in Gettysburg, and we all learned the Gettysburg Address and things of that nature. And I think you latch onto it in different ways. And I was always curious about the stories in which Black people weren't just slaves or enslaved people. And so I gravitated towards very early on the stories of James Fortin in Boston, who was an early ship maker and businessman, freed African, and Richard Allen, who was the founder of the AME Church in Philadelphia. And so to find out, as you asked earlier, that I actually had a legacy, a family connection to that larger history, that was actually pretty cool. And there's not a lot in the archive. I can find his name printed in places, there's records and cornerstones on church buildings and stuff. But the stories themselves really exist through the oral tradition. And so that's all sort of part of it. Yeah.
Can you talk about contextualizing and defining the legacy of African heritage people and why it is so important?
Yeah, I think I remember when the Finding Your Roots series came out, and I'm like very big into genealogy, obviously. I'm actually doing a talk with the genealogist group on Tuesday, but so much of the way in which it was framed in popular media was like this sort of curiosity or excitement that so many African Americans had European ancestry. You know, it was like, oh, the average African American is only 70 to 80% African, you know, like this pluralistic identity, which is certainly a part of my legacy as well, but also being Gullah Geechee and living in such a remote community for so many centuries, like I'm actually closer to 90% African, you know? And so I was interested in that African part of the story. And it's mentioned in the film, but also what connects me to other African diasporic or descendant people, you know, like literally connect. And so when I look at like my genealogy chart and I see, you know, the entire Western and central and southern coast of Africa, and even hits in Asia, Southeast Asia, and other places, like it really connects me to this larger fabric of being and humanity and ideals of indigeneity, you know, and like certainly the coast of South Carolina isn't the indigenous lands of Gullah Geechee people, but so much of like what it means to be a steward and a protector of that land and that space is something that I'm learning how to steward.
So the Gullah Geechee language is a composite of many West African languages and English. Why was it so important for you to really highlight that in your story?
Yeah, my grandmother died at like 98 years old, like 7 years ago. And I realized when she passed that her quality of voice would no longer exist in my life. Like that sound, the way she said my name, you know, like even John was always something else. For my brother, who we call JR, it was always Jar or Jon-Sesrie. You know, it's just it's something I'll never hear again. And so I wanted to record as much of what remained as possible. And what happened with this creolized language is in the early 20th century, it just sort of became regarded as being unintelligent, you know, and so it was bred out of children, if you will. And so when you actually meet people who are from like, especially a little older than my dad through his generation, like baby boomers, older boomers, like they have these accents that are so transatlantic. You're like, where are you from? You know, you're like, are you from Britain? Or like Andre Leon Talley or someone, you know, it's like, are you from Boston? And they're like, I'm from Georgia. And it's quite fascinating. But then if you go back just a few years more, there's people who like really retained the dialect and sort of the tonal quality. And I was just, and to continue to be like just so in love with the rhythm and the musicality of the language. And I think that's what we played a lot with in the film.
In 1526, the first Africans came from the Caribbean. And by the Civil War, 85% of the coastal areas were people of African descent. And then we're hearing about the tax liens and all of these beautiful inheritances of land and culture and how connected and how many hundreds of years people worked the land. And you just get the sense of like, you paint a very eloquent picture of how the terrible injustice that's happening. So I would love for you to talk a little bit too about your research process.
I think I over-researched the project. I mean, before I even picked up a camera, I was interviewing and doing oral histories with people, which included artists of Gullah Geechee descent. And so I sought out filmmaker Julie Dash, who was actually teaching at the College of Charleston at the time. And I just spoke to her because I wanted to build on the foundation that had already been laid, you know, like within the field, within the arts. And Jonathan Green, who is a Gullah Geechee painter based in Charleston from Beaufort, credited as one of the first Gullah Geechee artists with an MFA. I believe he went to RISD. But Yeah, I may get that, I said that wrong, but he's such a brilliant sort of vessel for articulating and expressing visually the feeling of being in the Low Country. And so I just wanted to speak with him and sit in his presence. And then I started moving closer to my family. And I really used the camera as a tool to interrogate, because I think asking questions just as an inquisitive young person doesn't always yield the response you want. But like when I showed up with like my crew and I like mic'd people up, they were like, oh, wait, like you actually want me to talk for 2 hours? And so that was really the process.
Can you talk about the importance of water? Because there's so much poetry in how you tell the story, the connection of water that the Gullah people have to water and the land.
I think water is such a fascinating sort of trope or metaphor, but water in of itself is such a container for so many things, or the water. And thinking of it in like a Christian sense, like water and baptism, and it's supposed to be this refreshing, healing thing. In the Bruce Lee sense, be water, like be one. But water also presents so much danger and trauma. And through the research process, I actually discovered a lot of stories that I never knew of traumatic experiences people have had associated with water. And there's always this like joke or thing about Black people not liking to swim or being near the water, but it's actually rooted in real trauma. And you think of a fishing village and people who are cautious of the water, not only from being brought over the water, like literally, and being displaced by water, but, I found out that my grandmother had a sibling who drowned in the ocean one time at the beach. So I think of the ways in which she was always protective and cautious of me going too deep into the water. I heard stories from several people of men going out on the boats for work and not returning. And so whether that was a drowning or a murder, it's like, who knows? All we know is that, someone's parent left for work in the morning to work on the water, which most of the community did. My grandfather was a longshoreman, and not returning. And so you really have a different relationship to water.
What would you like to see happen in American culture right now through storytelling and just generally?
Yeah, I think in storytelling, we get really caught up in like who did it first or who did it the biggest. And I think when we really think about the fabric of culture, it takes all of those textures. And so I want to hear from more voices. I want to hear more Gullah Geechee stories. I want to hear them from different perspectives. And I want to hear more stories from other people. Like I'm very interested in like Appalachian culture or, just parts of America that are really a part of the fabric of our nation that we like overlook and take for granted at times because it becomes too familiar and you just sort of expect it to be there. It's like I want to celebrate both the multifaceted experiences of people who have contributed to this nation, but also the history and truth behind many of the things that we just consider to be American. Like for Gullah Geechee people, like the word tote, like everyone knows what a tote bag is or to tote. But like that is a Geechee word. That's a Gullah word. And there's no association with that. And so like things like Memorial Day, knowing that was the formerly enslaved gathering at Hamden Park in Charleston to commemorate the fallen soldiers the year after the Civil War. And now it's just a national holiday that we think is associated with summer or something. And so I want to celebrate, all of that.
Gettysburg and Charleston have something in common. There were big battles that were fought and won, right? For the Union. I mean, important moments, lots of important moments in Charleston, right?
Yes. Like it was a huge turning point. John Smalls actually later became a U.S. congressman from Beaufort, South Carolina during Reconstruction. He took over a ship, a Confederate ship, and steered it through the Union blockade, and that was actually the turning point of the war, and so I like to include all of those heroes and all of those people who contributed to our being.
Thank you so much, filmmaker Jon-Sesrie Goff. I know you've got to go. Folks can see your beautiful film tomorrow,
Yes,
Friday
please
at
do.
4:30, Sunday at 11:30 a.m. at the Water's Edge Cinema. And thank you so much for speaking with us about Sherman.
And I just would like to say, if you want to learn more about Ayers property, which is discussed in the film, or Gullah Geechee culture, we have links to resources on our website, aftersherman.com. And you can also follow us on social media at After Sherman. And please share the film or in the showtimes with your friends if you enjoy it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Healing Wisdom at Outermost Radio. All of our shows are podcasts at WOMR.org. Also check out healingwisdomradioshow.com and contact me at pandora@WOMR.org.
Yeah. Cool.